Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Firefighters podcast, where we seek to develop, inspire, and motivate the world of the emergency services operator through a series of wide-ranging conversations. Now, before we go any further, just hit that rate, follow, or subscribe button on whatever platform you're listening to. It's a key performance indicator for us and helps us reach even more people. Now, here's what we've got for you today.
It's known as the golden hour, 60 minutes that are crucial in saving lives. But on this night in 2017, the wait for help took too long.
At long last, we are getting into another debrief. Now, absolutely love this debrief, and we've had so many requests in. We're in a very strange kind of position where we get inundated with a whole bunch of cool guest requests, and hands up, we have gone into a lot of guest content lately. But today we're able to get into one of the debriefs, one of the inquiries that's been on our list for a little while. There's a lot of controversy around this one. It's kind of a strange debrief in that it's different from some of the other stuff we've covered in the past. There was certainly mistakes made, certainly a lot of uncertainty, indecision, challenge, confusion, maybe a little bit of lack of assertiveness, lack of command presence, structure, misunderstanding. And it's going to be a challenging one to go through, but we are going to do our best to muddle through it, unpick the bits that have relevance, and from an emergency services perspective, we're going to try and see if we can learn some lessons from it. Hopefully never see something like this repeated.
Oh my God. What's going on? What just happened?
At 10:31, the show had just ended when a bomb was detonated.
There's a load of people lying around on the floor, there's blood everywhere.
Okay, what's the address of the emergency?
This sounds genuine. Please send ambulances.
We'll come in as fast as we can, okay?
Now, of course, as the title suggests, we are going to be covering the Manchester Arena bombing. Now, this happened on May 22nd, 2017. Now, this has been a highly publicised event, some of the findings for which have only been coming out in the past sort of few months. But at just after 10:30 on Monday the 22nd of May 2017, a suicide bomber detonated an improvised device in an area known as the City Room. Now, around 14,000 people, mainly teenagers and families, had gone to an event, travelled from across the UK to attend a concert by the very famous artist Ariana Grande, and the concert itself was just coming to an end. It was a busy foyer with exiting concert goers, waiting family members, and merchandise sellers as well. It was a substantial bomb that was used, containing nearly 2,000 nuts, and had a truly devastating impact. Now, the bomb killed 22 people, including many children. Over 100 were physically injured, and many more suffered psychological and emotional trauma. There was a huge response from many emergency services at different points, some delayed, and some were there as soon as they could be. I mean, paramedics treated many walking wounded at the city centre. Hospitals in Greater Manchester treated people with serious injuries, whilst many others made their way to hospitals across the wider region. Now, the Manchester Arena attack was the deadliest in the UK since London bombings of the 7th of July 2005, and although the Greater Manchester Resilience Forum had done many planning exercises, the events of the 22nd of May were something none of those involved had ever encountered before. This was one of those genuine real-world tests of the plans and assumptions that we have in place in emergency services all up and down the UK.
Heat and fear, and the heat was something... It was just something I cannot describe. It was horrendous. And then it blew me 2 metres from where I was stood. It was just carnage. You can't even describe. It was the smell. It was the soot up my nose. I couldn't taste anything. My hearing had gone. It was like an out of body experience. Like I was watching something else. This happened to someone else. In this day and age, we've got the best emergency services that we've got. You just expect them to be there.
So we're going to go into a little bit around the response to the attack. There is a lot to be proud of in the response to the emergency services, both in the city region of Greater Manchester and its emergency services. There are things to be said around collaborative partnerships, what went well, what didn't go well. And I will start by saying, although we are going to attempt to keep this informative and brief, I am very conscious that there were hundreds and hundreds, if not even thousands, of acts of individual bravery and selflessness of members of the public as well as our emergency services operators. However, it is vital that we do look at the lessons that we should have learned from this, what went well, what didn't go so well, the good, the bad and the ugly.
Our actions were substantially inadequate and fell short of what the public have every right to expect. And for this, I apologise unreservedly.
I want to apologise to the families of the victims and to every one of you affected by that terrible night.
We let the families and the public down in their time of need, and for that I am truly sorry.
It's a massive pleasure to welcome our new partner to the podcast, Gore-Tex Professional Fabrics. Now, I've personally worn Gore-Tex for nearly 2 decades, working operationally in hostile environments, tackling challenging incidents from firefighting to water incidents and in urban search and rescue environments. Gore-Tex have a well-earned reputation for protecting professionals in the fire and emergency services throughout their family of highly innovative, waterproof, breathable moisture barriers that exceed global performance standards and are trusted worldwide. It's a really exciting and humbling moment to be welcoming Gore-Tex to the family. And the best way for you to support the podcast is to go over and find out a little bit more about all of the partners that help bring this podcast to you. So expect a lot of things coming from us in the future as we work together as a partnership to help inform, educate and protect professionals in the fire and emergency services. Gore-Tex, going further together. Now back to the show. So we've pulled our information, our data from a few sources, having also spoken to people within the service who was responsible for the response. There is of course a dedicated website for some of this content as well, Manchester Arena Inquiry. Now they have put out 2 reports. There's a volume 1 and a volume 2. Today we're going to be focusing in on volume 2 predominantly, alongside a few other documents that we're going to draw information from. We're not skipping over the first volume for any malicious reasons. That one is based more around the security for the arena, whereas volume 2 is about the emergency response. Now again, I'm going to start by addressing the fact that this debrief is concerned predominantly with the emergency services response to the explosion, and to speak about some of the impact perhaps of the inadequacies in planning and preparation from the emergency services, whether or not some of this actually attributed to perhaps undermining the ability of the response to save life and therefore contributed to the extent of the loss of life at this incident. So we're effectively going to be focusing unfortunately on what went wrong on the night. And again, with all investigations and debriefs, this doesn't mean we're ignoring the evidence that went well. Massive heroism was shown by very many people. The bravery not just from the members of the public visiting the building, but of course from the personnel from the emergency services. Now, due to the nature of this and the multifaceted layers of different services and different interoperability and working together, we are going to include information about all services involved. So by 22:30, the Ariana Grande concert was nearly over. Members of the 14,500 strong audience had already begun to make their way out of the arena. Just 1 minute later, the Islamist extremist suicide bomber Salman Abedi, who for the benefit of the rest of this episode we'll refer to as the attacker, as that's the common terminology used across a lot of news outlets. This individual walked towards the departing crowd and detonated his deadly device. He did so near to the exit doors from the arena concourse. He intended to kill and injure as many people as possible. Just 1 minute later, Greater Manchester Police received the first of many 999 calls from the public. Those calls started to reveal the horror that had happened. A member of public in the city room made the first emergency call. He said that there'd been an explosion in the foyer near the old McDonald's restaurant. He said that 30 to 40 people were injured. At 22:32, Northwest Ambulance Service received its first 999 call as well. It was in similar stark terms, a bomb that had gone off near the box office, and a graphic description was given of the impact that it had caused. Many other 999 calls were to follow. Not all the emergency calls were clear. A small number referred to a shooting or gunshots. The situation was chaotic, and a joint effort by the emergency services under Jessup was expected to be able to respond to such an incident. It provides framework for a multi-agency response, and Jessup should ensure that the chaos of an unfolding incident is gripped as soon as possible. 4 British Transport police officers were in Manchester Victoria Railway Station. They heard the bomb go off and immediately made their way to the city room. As they did, they encountered some of those affected by the explosion. Showing considerable courage, the first 3 officers entered the city room fewer than 2 minutes after the explosion. Those officers reported to their control what they could see and hear. There were many casualties, and Police Constable Jessica Bullow messaged Transport Police Control Room from the city room at 22:33 to confirm that the bomb had been detonated, and the control confirmed that multiple ambulances were being requested and contact was being made. 3 minutes after the explosion, 4 transport officers were in the city room. 7 minutes after the explosion, 9 officers were in the city room. The first person from Emergency Training UK which is the arena's event healthcare provider, entered the city room, and together with the transport police officers and members of the public, they began to try and assist casualties. Transport officers were also sharing their situational awareness with their control, and it was the start of what should have been an effective, coordinated, multi-agency response to the attack. Unfortunately, that's not what happened. The Greater Manchester Police Force duty officer on the night of the attack was Inspector Dale Sexton. He was based at their control, and this was some distance from the headquarters. At 22:34, Inspector Sexton became aware of the incident, and at that point he became the tactical silver commander and the strategic gold commander for the incident. When he deployed firearms assets, he also became the initial tactical firearms commander and the strategic firearms commander. Inspector Sexton quickly became overburdened by the number of tasks he had to undertake. This had a direct impact on the effectiveness of the emergency response. It affected who received information, what resources were made available, and the decisions of other commanders. Inspector Sexton made a significant mistake in the early stages as he failed to declare a major incident. This omission was duplicated by other commanders during the critical period of the response, and it was not rectified until nearly 1 a.m. the following morning. At about the same time that Inspector Sexton became aware of the attack, Northwest Fire Control, which provided the control function for Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Services, was informed by Greater Manchester Police of an explosion in the city centre. The fire service control room operator created an entry in the system in readiness to mobilise resources straight to the scene of the attack. That mobilisation order was not given, as a supervisor intervened and decided that the Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Service Duty National Interagency Liaison Officer, also known as NILO, should be consulted before any mobilisation took place. The Transport Police had a similar role to Greater Manchester Police, which they called the position the Force Incident Commander. At 22:35, the Force Incident Manager, Inspector Benjamin Dawson, declared himself in command of the incident. Within 4 minutes, he declared a major incident, which the Transport Police communicated the declaration to the Northwest Ambulance Service at 22:41. It did not, however, communicate it to either Greater Manchester Police or the fire service at the relevant stage. This was an error and an early example of many failures in communication that were to emerge across the multi-agency emergency response. The Transport Police incident log reveals that the Transport Police Control did try to contact Greater Manchester Police at the early stages, and at 22:37, the incident log records still on hold with Greater Manchester Police. The police incident log indicates that contact was made with the Transport Police at 22:39, but that the Transport Police was in the 9999 queue along with many others. The Transport Police had failed to appreciate that it did have better means of communicating directly with Greater Manchester Police, using a radio channel reserved for police services to contact each other. At 22:36, the Ambulance Service Control called Greater Manchester Police Control. Ambulance Control was on hold for over 2 minutes, and when they spoke, the ambulance operator stated, "We're 10 minutes away. We've got quite a lot of ambulances coming." Later in the call, the Ambulance Control stated that they had 5 at least ambulances on the way and that more were being contacted. Police Control informed Ambulance Control that there were probably at least 20 police officers on the scene. As the call between the ambulance and the police was taking place, another Ambulance Control operator called Fire Control and informed them that a bomb had gone off in the arena. In that call, the fire service was not told that the ambulance service was in the process of deploying personnel to Manchester Central Fire Station, less than a mile from the scene, and also to the scene itself. At 22:36, Inspector Sexton directed the dispatch of firearms officers at the Victoria Exchange. Shortly afterwards, he granted formal authority for the firearms officers to deploy with their weapons, and this was an important sensible step. The ambulance service advanced paramedic Patrick Ennis was on duty at Central Manchester Ambulance Station. He quickly became aware of the 999 call, and commendably, he decided to deploy directly to the arena. At 22:38, he told the control that he was on his way to the scene. At the Victoria Exchange complex at 22:36, Transport Police officers were doing all they could to help the casualties. Situation updates were provided to the Transport Police Control. However, none of the Transport Police officers in the city room declared a major incident either. None of the Transport Police officers in the city room provided a methane message. This was due to a failure by the Transport Police to prepare them adequately for a situation that they would be confronted with. Manchester Police's Inspector Michael Smith understood the need to grip the unfolding response. He was notified about the attack by the control at 22:34. He acted with speed, and within minutes he started to make his way to the arena. He did so at 22:36 and informed Manchester Police Control that the RVP should be at the parking area outside the cathedral. This was recorded in the incident log as the cathedral car park, and it was passed on to Northwest Fire Control at 22:40. It was also given to Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Service by Police Control much later at 23:54. But it was never used by any agency. At 22:40, Inspector Smith contacted the Police Control again. Having heard that there was already police officers on scene, Inspector Smith said he wanted all officers to go to the scene directly. Inspector Smith intended this to be understood as the new RVP. However, it was not passed on as such, to Northwest Fire Control and Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Service. Before the arrival at the scene of Inspector Smith, Sergeant David Corley was one of the two sergeants present. One of the first actions was to reject a request made at 2240 by the Transport Police Sergeant in Liverpool for an RVP. Sergeant Corley said it was not possible to identify an RVP because of the need to focus on treating casualties. This was an error. It was his responsibility as a supervising officer to assess the situation and to identify how best to coordinate the response on the ground with the resources he had. It is a difficult thing to do, and it requires training and experience. A multi-agency RVP was urgently required, and it was an important step that would have helped to co-locate resources for the emergency response. Northwest Ambulance Service had decided that Manchester Central Fire Station would be used as its ambulance's main RVP. Northwest Ambulance Services Control informed Transport Police of this decision about moving the RVP at 2241. 3 minutes later, the Transport Police Police Constable Carl Roach declared an RVP at the Fish Dock car park. This was an area of a Corporation Street side of the Victorian Exchange complex. The incident log records that the RVP should have been passed to the Manchester Police. However, no evidence has been shown that this was ever communicated. And again, this RVP was never used by any emergency services during the critical period of the response. In the first quarter of an hour of the attack and thereafter, there was a substantial confusion over the location of an RVP. Each emergency service chose their own. In some cases, this was passed on to other agencies, but in most it was not. There should have been a concerted effort to agree a multi-agency RVP where all emergency services could co-locate. At the time of the attack, the emergency services operating in Greater Manchester were in the process of setting up a radio talk group that allowed the control rooms for each emergency service to communicate with each other directly and simultaneously. It should have been operational by the 22nd of May, but it was not. One of the issues it would have helped with was to resolve the multi-agency RVP. At around 22:39, the Ambulance Service Control contacted Anne-Marie Rooney, the Ambulance Service On-Call Tactical Commander. She was told of the reports of the bomb explosion at the arena, and at 22:39, she told the control to get the HART team, the Hazard Areas Response Team, en route to the area. Ambulance Control had known since 22:32 that a bomb had been detonated. The need for HART should have been identified before 22:39. The sooner HART is notified in an event such as the bomb explosion, the better. The ambulance service had two 6-person HART crews on duty that night, one covering Cheshire on Merseyside, and one based in Greater Manchester. At the time, Anne-Marie Rooney spoke to the Ambulance Service Control, and a HART team that was closest to the Victorian Exchange was mobilised. At 22:40, Northwest Fire Control informed the Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Service duty Nilo, who at the time was Station Manager Andrew Berry, of the attack. He decided to discuss what was happening with the FDO. Although now out of date, Station Manager Berry was informed of the Cathedral Car Park RVP declared by Inspector Smith 3 minutes earlier. Station Manager Berry rejected that RVP because he was not confident that it was safe. Instead, Station Manager Berry directed Northwest Fire Control to mobilise Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Service resources to Phillips Park Fire Station, 3 miles from Victoria Exchange Complex. He should not have done this. Station Manager Berry's rejection of the Cathedral Car Park set in motion a series of events that resulted in Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Service not arriving at the Victoria Exchange Complex until over 2 hours after the attack occurred. The effect of Station Manager Berry's decision to mobilise to Phillips Park Fire Station was that the fire appliances at Manchester Central Fire Station drove away from, not towards, the incident. While driving away from the incident, the Manchester Central Fire Appliances drove past ambulances travelling in the opposite direction. At the same time that Police Constable Roach was declaring an RVP at the Fish Dock car park, the Transport Police Senior Duty Officer, Anthony Lodge, contacted the Transport Police Divisional Commander for the area in which the arena was located. This was Chief Superintendent Alan Gregory. Chief Superintendent Gregory made his way to the Transport Police Control Room in Birmingham. In due course, he would not take over from Inspector Dawson as the Transport Police Civil Commander. The first firearms officers arrived at Victoria Exchange Complex 8 minutes after the explosion. Initially, the FDO was told the reports of an explosion were a false alarm and that it was nothing more than fireworks. It became quickly apparent that this was wrong, and by 22:41, a firearms officer outside the arena, PC Lee Moore, updated them of major casualties. The FDO authorised an emergency search at 22:42. This was a specialist tactic that involved locating and neutralising any threat. At about the same time, PC Lee Moore again confirmed to Manchester Police Control that there were casualties. He indicated that it was believed a ball-bearing device had caused harm, and then ended his radio message. Operation Plato, Operation Plato. At 22:43, a pair of firearms officers, one of whom was PC Lee Moore, entered the city room for the raised walkway. Approximately 1 minute later, they emerged onto the arena concourse, having crossed the city room. During their walk through the city room, they conducted a raw check for any gunman who might be present. No such threat was identified by them. 2 minutes later, those 2 firearms officers had joined 3 other firearms officers at the doors of the city room on the arena concourse. At 22:46, Northwest Ambulance Service became the second emergency services after the transport to police to declare a major incident at the Victoria Exchange complex. The declaration was not shared with any other emergency service despite the requirement that it should be. Following the declaration, a series of calls were made to notify local hospitals of the major incident declaration, giving approximate casualty numbers. Ambulance service records indicate that by 2300, 6 hospitals had been informed by the major incident declaration. Around the same time as the ambulance service major incident declaration, Manchester Police's Chief Inspector Mark Dexter was notified about the attack. He placed himself on duty and immediately began making his way to the arena. At 22:47, Inspector Sexton declared Operation Plato. Now in 2017, Operation Plato was the emergency service's designation for the response to an attack by a marauding terrorist with a firearm. Although, as it turned out, there were no armed terrorists within the arena or the wider area, but this was a reasonable decision. There had been some reports of gunshots. In 2017, there was a focus within counter-terrorism on such attacks because of the incident elsewhere in the world. Inspector Sexton therefore could not discount the possibility that a marauding terrorist firearms attack was underway. Unfortunately, once again, this wasn't communicated to other services. The failure to communicate Operation Plato declaration had significant consequences. It affected the ability of the emergency services to work together by jointly understanding the risk. Communication was not the only failure in relation to Operation Plato. The declaration of Operation Plato required zones to be applied. The purpose of the zones is to ensure emergency responders are protected from any terrorists who may be present. There was a substantial failure by police at every level of armed command in relation to the zoning of Victoria Exchange complex during the golden hour. At around 22:50, consultant paramedic Daniel Smith radioed Northwest Ambulance Service, and at the time he was travelling to the Victoria Exchange complex. He was told by control to remain at the RVP at Manchester Central Fire Station pending his arrival at the scene. And at 22:50, there were 2 ambulances on the forecourt of Manchester Central Fire Station. A third ambulance arrived at 22:53 and a fourth at 22:56. A fifth and sixth were there just after 11 o'clock. This intervention by Daniel Smith was an error. It was made at the time when Daniel Smith was not part of the command structure. It was not until a few minutes later that ambulance control issued an instruction to the ambulances at Manchester Central Fire Station to deploy to the scene. Just before this, at 22:48, Station Manager Berry from the fire service spoke to Northwest Fire Control. He said that he could not reach the FDO. In contrast to what the firearms officers in the city room knew, he was told that, in addition to there being over 60 casualties, there were reports of active shooter. Station Manager Berry was not told that ambulances were being deployed and that the police were already on scene, with more officers on the way. By this time, Station Manager Berry had mobilised Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Service marauding terrorist firearms attack specialist to Phillips Park Fire Station. The fire service's response had already diverged from the other emergency services, meaning their requirements of JESID were not even being met. Jonathan Butler and Stephen Taylor were the ambulance service's tactical advisors, or NILOs, on the night 22nd of May 2017. Jonathan was contacted by ambulance service control and mobilised to the scene. He lived approximately 45 minutes away. Immediately after this call, Jonathan contacted Stephen Taylor. It was agreed with Jonathan would travel to the scene and Stephen Taylor would provide cover from home while he did so. This was a sensible arrangement. Stephen then tried on a number of occasions to contact the FDO. Like the Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Service officers, he could not get through. Looking back to the fire service operations at around 22:48, Station Manager Berry had decided to set off from his home to Phillips Park Fire Station. This was a journey of more than 20 miles. In the course of it, he became lost due to diversions. At the time he set off, he was not to know what he would encounter the difficulties he did. However, it should have been obvious to Station Manager Berry that his geographical location meant that a substantial amount of time would be spent driving, rather than being devoted to developing and advancing the Fire and Rescue Service's response. The fire service response was already significantly out of step with that of the Transport Police, the Manchester Police, and the ambulance service. Travelling at such a critical time was not going to improve that. Station Manager Berry should have given his undivided attention to progressing the fire service's response to the incident. He had great difficulty contacting the FDO. It is a striking feature of the evidence that he made no attempt to contact the ambulance service NILOs, nor did he make any effort to contact the Transport Police despite the attack occurring within a transport hub. Instead, he spoke only to the Northwest Fire Service Control and Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Service officers during his drive to Manchester. In the course of these conversations, he learned nothing new about the incident. These conversations served to recycle the existing knowledge about what had happened, not an increase in situational awareness. It's important to note that the NILO role was not a command role. However, Station Manager Berry was effectively in charge of the Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Service's response throughout the entire time he was driving. During this time, Inspector Dawson, on behalf of the Transport Police, was still trying to gain an understanding of what was happening at the scene. He made a number of requests for a methane message to be provided, and at 22:50 he tried again to broadcast a request over the radio for someone to provide a methane message. Sergeant Corley agreed to provide one, but was not able to communicate it to Inspector Dawson for another 7 minutes. By 22:50 a methane message should have been provided by the Transport Police Control, and then disseminated to all other emergency services. To recap, within 20 minutes of the explosion, a concerted effort had been made by those on the scene to ensure that the city room was secure from further threat and to help all casualties in the location. However, a great deal had already been started to go wrong. Only the Transport Police and the ambulance service had declared a major incident. Neither declaration had been shared with other agencies, and there was no clear multi-agency rendezvous point, and there had been no discussion about an FCP. Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Service had rejected the police's RVP and decided to muster on its own. Some distance from the Victoria Exchange complex, the ambulance service control had not deployed to the scene ambulances that were close by. Despite efforts by Inspector Dawson, no methane message had been passed from the scene. As I've already said, Operation Plato had been declared by the police but not communicated to other emergency services. Had the response proceeded as it should have, Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Service would have had personnel at, or very close to, the Victoria Exchange complex by 22:50. This could have been achieved had any one of the following been done. First, this could have been achieved through the use of multi-agency control talk group. Had it been progressed to the operational stage more quickly than it was, the system in operation on the night of the attack involved each emergency services making a call to another emergency service and waiting to be connected in order to pass on information. Inspector Smith made a request at 22:40 for all officers to come straight to the scene. If all the control rooms had been communicating with each other on a single radio channel, this information would have been disseminated to all other emergency services at that time. Second, this could have been achieved through a methane message passed to Northwest Fire Control in the first 15 minutes, stating that Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Service was required at the scene. Realistically, at this stage, this could have only originated from the Transport Police. Thirdly, it could have been achieved through the duty Nilo initially accepting the police's RVP, or through the duty Nilo accepting the police's RVP once he found they had not yet got through to the FDO. As it was, another 1 hour and 45 minutes would have passed before Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Service had any personnel at the scene. At 22:52, Station Manager Berry called Northwest Fire Control and asked to mobilise 3 more Nilos. The extra Nilos requested by Station Manager Berry were not contacted by Northwest Fire Control for at least 14 minutes. The Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Service response was being severely hampered by delays and failures in communication. The call by Station Manager Berry was an opportunity for Northwest Fire Control to share its knowledge that ambulances were deployed on the scene and that police officers were already there. This information was not shared. Station Manager Berry remained of the view that there was a risk that a marauding terrorist firearms attack was underway. Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Service resources continued to be directed away from the scene, out of step with the other emergency services. By this time at 22:53, advanced paramedics had made their way into the scene. Paramedic Patrice Ennis sent a methane message to Northwest Ambulance Service Control, and this was the first methane message sent by anyone. In the message, he confirmed that it was a major incident and stated that there were at least 40 casualties and 10 deceased. He thought there were at least a dozen casualties in the P1 priority level of most serious injured. He confirmed that ambulances were still needed. The Ambulance Service Control replied to confirm that everyone is now making their way to Hunts Bank. However, for a number of ambulances already sent to Manchester Central Fire Station, it was to be another 12 minutes before they would set off to the location of the arena. The methane message again did not identify the Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Service personnel were not present, or that they were even needed. The ambulance service did not share the methane message with the Transport Police, the Manchester Police, or Fire Control. This compounded earlier failures by the ambulance service to share its major incident declaration. 2 minutes after paramedic Patrick Ennis arrived to make his assessment, Manchester police officers from the Tactical Aid Unit, led by Sergeant Hare, entered the city room. Sergeant Hare directed his team to work in pairs and give first aid, reflecting his belief that, at the time, paramedics were on their way. That was not the case. The police officers did all they could, but they did not have the training of paramedics, and there was a limit to what they could achieve. Just before the arrival of Sergeant Hare, the Operational Firearms Commander PC Richardson made a request for explosives detection dogs. He made further requests for this to the FDO at 22:54 and 2300, but it wasn't until 23:47 that a Transport Police explosive detection dog arrived, 75 minutes after the explosion. The early attendance of explosive detection dogs would have enabled prompt confirmation that there was no secondary device in the city room. At 22:55, Northwest Fire Control was informed by the police's control that ambulance service had a bronze commander on the scene. This was a reference to Patrick Ennis, who Inspector Smith had mistaken for the ambulance service operational commander. this information was passed on to only Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Service officer who failed to register it. It was not passed on to any other Fire and Rescue Service officers that night. 2 minutes after this call, Station Manager Berry spoke to Northwest Fire Control. He was not given this information. Had it been shared with Station Manager Berry at this point, he may have changed the course he had set Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Service on. This was another example of a failure to ensure situational awareness for a multi-agency emergency response. Between 22:58 and 23:03, Inspector Dawson talked Sergeant Corley through the elements of methane. This was the second methane message of the night. Inspector Dawson explained that this was so that he could coordinate and get support to the scene. In the course of receiving the methane message, Inspector Dawson stated, "We're just going to get as many ambulances and fire to you as we can." Despite the time spent obtaining the information and recording it in the Transport Police incident log, the methane message again was not passed to any other emergency service. The passing on of the methane message is an essential part of the sharing of development of each emergency service's situational awareness. This had the most significant impact on Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Service. At the time, the Transport Police methane message was being passed from the scene. The Fire and Rescue Service was mustering at Phillips Park Fire Station. If the Transport Police had passed the methane message to Northwest Fire Control, it could have been relayed to the Station Manager Berry. It was to be another 70 minutes before Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Service considered it sufficiently safe to deploy firefighters to the scene. Halfway through the golden hour, there was still no common RVP, and not one person involved in the response had ever mentioned an FCP. No one in command roles in the other emergency services had recognised that Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Service had decided to mobilise to a fire station 3 miles from Victoria Exchange Complex. Consultant paramedic Daniel Smith arrived at the scene at 22:59. He wasn't part of the ambulance service's planned command structure for the night. Shortly after he arrived, he took up the role of the ambulance service's operational commander. There was an urgent need for paramedics to triage and provide life-saving treatment to the injured in the city room. At 23:01, the only personnel Daniel Smith had immediately available for deployment were a doctor, a senior paramedic, 2 paramedics and a student paramedic. He chose to send the 2 paramedics and the student paramedic to Trinity Way. He did so on the basis that the police had told him there was at least one critically ill patient on Trinity Way. These ambulance service personnel should not have been deployed until Daniel Smith had a better understanding of what was happening. Only then could he assess the paramedics could make the greatest contribution. At 23:06, Northwest Fire Control was informed by one of the fire crews who had left Manchester Central Fire Station and travelled to Phillips Park Fire Station that ambulances were arriving at their home station as they departed. This was important information that Northwest Fire Control failed to act upon. It was not passed to Station Manager Berry either. At the time Northwest Fire Control was being informed of this, those ambulances at Manchester Central Fire Station began to leave in convoy for Hunts Bank. The first ambulance in the convoy arrived at the Victoria Exchange Complex 2 minutes later. The Northwest Ambulance Service or Transport Police methane messages were not shared with Northwest Fire Control. Consequently, Fire Control did not have them to share with the Station Manager Berry. Station Manager Berry stated in evidence that, had he received either of those messages, the Fire and Rescue Service would have responded straight away. This evidence was accepted and it stands as a very clear example of the importance of methane messages being shared. It is also the reason why responsibility for Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Service's failure to attend within the first 2 hours does not rest solely on the fire service or fire control. Because he was so far away, Station Manager Berry should have remained at home and mobilised another officer who lived closer to go to the scene. This should be standard procedure. By approximately 23:10, one paramedic had been triaging for 5 minutes in the city room, alongside members of the public and others in Victoria Exchange. Unarmed Manchester police officers and Transport Police officers continued their efforts to help the injured. With the exception of the firearms officers who had ballistic protection, none of those working in the city room were wearing PPE. Inspector Smith was providing an effective command to the unarmed police officers in the city room. However, the responsibilities of that role meant that another senior officer was required to ensure that the JESIP requirements were being met. Someone needed to review the whole scene. In particular, there was still a need for an FCP, where commanders could co-locate and communicate. This would have allowed them to share situational awareness and jointly assess the risk. From this, they could have coordinated their efforts more effectively. The failure to dispatch the ambulances already at the travel into Manchester Central Fire Station meant that there were fewer resources available to the Ambulance Service Operation Commander in the first 5 minutes of his command. The Ambulance Service Operational Commander made his command decisions without reference to the superior situational awareness of the police. His risk assessment was that the city room was not safe enough for non-specialists to work in. By contrast, both Manchester Police and the Transport Police considered the city room safe enough for specialists, non-specialists, employees of civilian organisation and members of the public to operate in. As for Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Service, its crews were mustered at Phillips Park Fire Station in another part of the city. Finally, at 23:25, the Manchester Central Fire Station watch manager telephoned Fire Control. He told Fire Control that he was with a firefighter whose wife was a paramedic. She was at the scene. This was important information. The other emergency services were co-locating at the scene, but fire control did not pass this information on to the station manager. It was an opportunity over 45 minutes after the attack for a step back to be taken. This would have led to the realization, even at this late stage, that the fire and rescue service had taken a completely different approach to that of the ambulance service. Hey folks, just wanted to jump in with a quick piece around firefighter health and well-being. Whether you are trying to join the fire service and pass them tricky fitness tests, if you are currently serving, or if you are coming up to that next chapter of your life, retiring from the emergency services, we get so many different questions around it. So in partnership with Fitness for the Frontline, we have come up with a series of guidance and programs specifically designed to reflect the physical elements of the role of a firefighter. So whether it's carrying an LPP across an overgrown field, lifting a ladder above your head under running it, or wrestling with cutting gear for 30 plus minutes at some kind of complicated RTC, our bodies are required to lift, push, and carry objects in very specific circumstances. That is effectively what Fitness on the Frontline focuses on, as well as the longer term aspects of overall health and wellness for our firefighters. Now, we are definitely not about to be smashing out world records or getting that beach body ready in 6 weeks rubbish. The systems and programs that we put in place are adjusted for people's current fitness levels, and they're not a prescriptive weight or a one-size-fits-all BS. It is very likely for myself personally that I'm still going to be a firefighter when I'm 60 plus, so longevity in the role is really important to me, and I know it is for so many people out there. It all starts with no obligation, 7 days worth of the programming, absolutely free. So whether you're joining, serving, or looking at the next chapter in your life, Fitness for the Frontline is designed by firefighters for firefighters. Now back to the show. At 23:28, Group Manager Carlos Meakin, who had been mobilised as a second Nilo, called fire control. He repeated the information that the Manchester Central Fire Station crews had seen ambulances pulling up there as they were leaving for Phillips Park Fire Station. He was told that the deployment to Phillips Park Fire Station was Station Manager Berry's decision, and that the ambulance service was aware that Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Service was mustering at Phillips Park Fire Station. By 23:30, Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Service had mobilised a significant number of senior officers. The Chief Fire Officer, an area manager, and 4 group managers were all involved in the Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Service response. 2 of the group managers went to Phillips Park Fire Station. The other senior officers made their way to the Fire Service Command Support Room at their headquarters. Each of them had a different level of knowledge about the incident at this time. The primary reason why no one from the fire service had gripped the response by 23:30 was Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Service's approach to incident command. The fire service's policy at the time was that the incident commander was the most senior fire officer at the scene. The difficulty that policy created was seen in Station Manager Berry's initial mobilising decision, which was that those responding should go somewhere other than the scene itself. That meant that by 23:30, with no one at the scene, Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Service did not have an incident commander. This was a significant gap in the Fire and Rescue Service's policy. It was a gap that should have been identified and filled before the events of the 22nd of May 2017. Those that knew of Station Manager Berry's initial mobilising decision deferred to him, expecting him to get further information from the FDA. None of those who deferred to Station Manager Berry's initial decision knew that he had been given an RVP near the scene by Greater Manchester Police and had rejected it. By 23:30, the Fire and Rescue Service was still not at the scene. Its response had stalled. As the golden hour ended, there were 25 casualties in the casualty clearing station. 6 were P2 casualties, who had been carried out of the city room on makeshift stretchers. There were still 4 P1 casualties, who needed to be carried out of the city room to the casualty clearing station. A concentrated focus on the casualties required during that golden hour. Despite the best efforts of those working selflessly in the city room, the emergency response had failed to achieve this effective evacuation. 1 hour after the explosion, the full structure of the coordinated response was still not in place. Transport Police did not have a bronze commander on the scene. The Fire and Rescue Service had not started directing resources even to the incident itself, and only 3 paramedics were in the city room, 2 of them for only the last 15 minutes of this period. The FDO had not communicated his declaration of Operation Plato to other emergency services, and none of the emergency services had gripped the response to the attack as they should have. It would take a substantial part of the next hour of the response and beyond for that to happen. The second hour began with the emergency services focusing their efforts at 3 locations. Police officers from both Manchester Police and the Transport Police were in the city room. With them from the ambulance service were 3 paramedics, and the ambulance service's focus was on the station concourse and station approach, where paramedics and doctors were managing 25 seriously injured casualties. Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Service had mustered its resources 3 miles away. As the incident continued, Greater Manchester Police and the ambulance service began to regain some structure, and by 23:40, Station Manager Berry had reached Phillips Park Fire Station. Also present was Group Manager Ben Levy, At approximately 23:45, Group Manager Levy declared himself to be the incident commander. This was the right thing for him to do. This was an attempt to grip the Fire and Rescue Service's response. It did not have the effect that Group Manager Levy was intending. Following Group Manager Levy's self-appointment, Station Manager Berry got through to the Manchester Police on the FDO telephone line. He did not speak to the FDO. The person he spoke to had been asked by Inspector Sexton to answer the FDO phone. Through no fault of his own, that person was not competent to answer the FDO telephone. Station Manager Berry asked for a location of an FCP. During an unsatisfactory conversation, Station Manager Berry was initially told, "I think there's been a liaison at the cathedral." This was a reference to the RVB, which Inspector Smith gave at 22:37, well over an hour ago, but which he superseded at 22:40. Station Manager Berry was then given a location of the Old Boddington's car park. Dissatisfied with the information he was given, Station Manager Berry rejected that location and said the Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Service was going to go to Manchester Central Fire Station. Following this call, Group Commander Levy called Chief Fire Officer Peter O'Reilly. Group Manager Levy wanted to go forward to the Victoria Exchange complex. Chief Fire Officer O'Reilly did not realise that Group Manager Levy had appointed himself as the incident commander. A misunderstanding between them resulted in a Group Manager Levy believing that he had been told that he must not go further than Manchester Central Fire Station. The Fire and Rescue Service resources at Phillips Park Fire Station moved forward to the Manchester Fire Station. At 12 minutes past midnight, now on the 23rd of May, Chief Fire Officer O'Reilly spoke to the Ambulance Service Operational Commander Stephen Hines, whom he knew personally. Stephen Hines, who did not know about the Operation Plato Declaration, told Chief Fire Officer O'Reilly that the Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Service Operation Plato specialist resources were not required. Stephen Hines did request 12 non-specialist firefighters and a commander. Following a debate in the Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Service Command Support Room, Chief Fire Officer O'Reilly directed that his resources requested by Stephen Hines should go forward. In the course of that mobilisation, a Fire and Rescue Service officer learned of Operation Plato Declaration by the police. He did not ask about the zoning, but did pass on the fact of the declaration. This did not lead to the deployment of Operational Plato specialist resources. It should have caused Chief Fire Officer O'Reilly to send forward the specialist firefighters. Now at the end of the second hour, the Fire and Rescue Service resources were still 7 minutes away from arriving at the scene. Despite what we've attempted to do here, the overview of the emergency services response can't really be covered in detail of what happened. Instead, what we've tried to show is that the standards required by JESIP and the Joint Doctrine to achieve an effective multi-agency response were effectively not met. There are a number of themes in the problems that arose in the emergency response. Firstly, there was obviously a lack of communication between emergency responders, both through the act of physically co-locating at a single multi-agency RVP and via radio. Next, there was a failure to have available either a multi-agency control talk group or to set one up on the night. This would have allowed control rooms to speak to each other. Thirdly, there was a failure by the FDO to inform other emergency services of the declaration of Operation Plato. Fourthly, there was a failure of the FDO and other groups in the Manchester Police consider zoning at the scene. As I've already mentioned, there was a failure to set up an FCP, which should have been done by the responsibility of the police. There were delays in ambulance services getting ambulances to the paramedics to the scene. There was a failure to send the heart operators into the rooms where they could have been of most use triaging and life-saving interventions. As I've already mentioned, there was obviously a failure by the Fire and Rescue Service to arrive on scene and make the contribution in removing the injured that its officers could have easily done. There were several failures for the fire control to give important information to the officers in Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Service. And finally, there was a failure of anyone in a senior position in Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Services to take a grip of the situation during the critical period of response.
Never again will we fall short of what the public should rightly expect of their fire and rescue service. I hope that the public will recognise that Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Service is a very different organisation today to what it was in 2017.
In this final part, we're just going to try and recap and encapsulate some of the actions by fire service personnel and North West Fire Control. Some of the key findings were that the decision to contact Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Service National Interagency Liaison Officer before the mobilisation was reasonable. There was repeated failures to pass on relevant information by North West Fire Control staff. Responsibility for this lies with the Fire Control. However, this failure contributed to Greater Manchester's Fire and Rescue Service failures to arrive at the scene before 0036 the day after the event. It's acknowledged that North West Fire Control team leaders should have acted when they realised the divergence in approach between the Fire and Rescue Service and other emergency services, and they should have drawn it to the attention of the Fire and Rescue Service's senior officers. I do just want to take a moment to speak about some of the actions that happened on the fire station. For example, the first calls themselves happened from a fire station perspective. Watch Manager Andrew Simister was stationed at Manchester Fire Station on the night of the 22nd of May. At 22:38, he received a mobilisation pre-alert. This pre-alert was automatically generated as a result of one of the control operators creating an incident log for the arena. Manchester Central Fire Station was the closest station at the arena. The crews received the mobilisation to Phillips Park Fire Station. The watch manager and his 2 fire appliances drove to Phillips Park Fire Station. Once there at 23:06, the watch manager called fire control and spoke to him. Watch manager Simister stated, "All the ambulances pulled on at Central as we left." The control operator responded by confirming that it had been the Nilo's decision to mobilise to Phillips Park Fire Station and that further information was awaited. The fact that the watch manager communicated to control that all the ambulances arriving at Central Fire Station, the control operator assumed they were doing that in order to follow the fire appliances to Phillips Park Station. The control operator made no entry into the incident log in relation to that information, despite the fact they should have done that. In addition to making that record, the operator should have asked the watch manager where the ambulances were going, and if in fact they did follow the fire appliances. They hadn't received any information up to that point that the ambulances were going to be sent to Phillips Park Fire Station. The information in the incident log was to the opposite effect. Ambulances were being employed to the scene. The operator shouldn't have made the assumption that they did, and as a result, a further opportunity to note the contrasting approaches between the ambulance service and the fire service was missed. A watch manager again contacted fire control at 23:25. On this occasion, he spoke to a different control operator, asked them for an update. He was asked about the reason for his request. The watch manager stated that he has a firefighter here whose wife is a paramedic and that she is on the scene. Whilst we are stood by doing nothing, the watch manager was clearly getting a bit frustrated. The control operator explained that the group manager were on their way to Phillips Park Fire Station. Control apologised for the lack of update, and the watch manager, to his credit, asked if there were any fire service actually on the scene yet. The control operator replied no, stating that there was believed to be a second bomb, and she believed that the police were searching for it. This watch manager's phone call contained important information, showing the contrast between the ambulance service's approach and the fire and rescue service's approach. The fact that a member of his crew had their spouse actually on the scene as a member of the ambulance service carrying out rescues. Watch manager Simister had reliable information directly from the scene. He had passed it on to control, and it should have been acted upon. This information should have been escalated immediately to the control room operator's team leader. It was an opportunity, more than 45 minutes after the attack, for the fire control to re-evaluate their approach. If it had been escalated, it would have led to the realisation, even at this late stage, that the fire and rescue service had taken a completely different approach to the ambulance service. It was obvious to the watch manager who made the call that this was the case. This phone call from the watch manager didn't make its way onto any of the logs. Group managers and area managers continued to liaise with control, but at no point did any new information come to light, despite the situational update from station. There is a series of pieces of information inside the inquiry which relate to certain specific members of the team in control and a series of errors that took place. Out of respect for those individuals, I'm not going to name their names, but in conclusion, there were a number of areas in which the fire control response to the attack was inadequate. There was a failure on a number of occasions to offer or provide adequate information for updates to the fire and rescue service officers when speaking to them. There was a failure on a number of occasions to seek Jessup information when speaking to the Transport Police, the Ambulance Service, and the Greater Manchester Police. There was a failure to contact the Transport Police, Ambulance Service, and Manchester Police for the purpose of gaining situational awareness. Most fundamentally, there was a failure by the fire control staff to recognise and act upon the fact that the approach being taken by the fire and rescue service was obviously divergent from the approach of the ambulance service and the police that they had known was taking place. Control room operators should have been escalating the inconsistency in approach to the team leaders. The team leaders should have been proactively contacting and challenging fire and rescue service operators in light of what was known about other agencies' response. By 2300, the team leaders should have identified that over 15 minutes had passed since Station Manager Berry had said he would contact them. The team leaders should have contacted Station Manager Berry and inquired whether a different approach was required. They should have offered to help him get the information he needed. They should have considered contacting the police, the Transport Police, or the Ambulance Service to obtain a full situational report to give Station Manager Berry and assist him in the decision-making process. However, this is not something they've been trained to do. From a number of reports and inquiries, it's been identified that many individuals from fire control should have acted differently. It is considered that fire control as an organisation is responsible for the failures. There was a failure to prepare staff adequately for an incident such as this attack. Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Service was well prepared for a marauding terrorist firearms attack or other terrorist attacks. Despite this, the Fire and Rescue Service operators did not attend the Victoria Exchange complex until 2 hours and 6 minutes after the explosion, and there's a number of causes for this unacceptable delay. As was said ad nauseum, the communication factors between emergency services was inadequate. There was also occasions of inadequate communication simply between the fire and rescue service officers, assumptions made by some of them on insufficient information, and instances of critical challenge failing to take place and poor decision making by some. There was also a structural issue, which Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Service had failed to foresee. It operated a system in which the incident commander only took up the command role on arriving at the scene. In a situation where no one goes to the scene, there is no incident commander. The lack of a single person in charge of the incident made a major contribution to the delay. In its closing statement, Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Service stated that no one can doubt that the firefighters, including the officers and the commanders, take real risks on a day-to-day basis, putting themselves and those they command into dangerous situations to rescue others. They do so willingly and without complaint. It cannot fairly be said that there was a general aversion to risk, but it is clear, however, that the Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Service response on the night of the 22nd of May could fairly be described as risk-averse. We're going to bring the incident debrief to a close there. Hopefully you have managed to draw a great deal of takeaways from that. I know we've repeated, or appear to have repeated, several points. These are as they have occurred in different documents across different inquiries. Ultimately, on the 22nd of May 2017, an incredibly and tragic event took place. A bomber detonated a shrapnel-laden homemade bomb as people were leaving the Manchester Arena. 23 people were unfortunately killed. 1,017 were injured. Many of them were children. Several hundred people suffered psychological trauma. The bomber himself was aged just 22 years. After initial suspicions of terrorist attack, police had later said they believed that the individual had largely acted alone, but that others had been aware of his plans. In March 2020, the bomber's brother was found guilty of 22 counts of murder and attempting to murder 1,017 others. This individual was sentenced to life in prison. The incident covered today was the deadliest terrorist attack from the first suicide bombing in the United Kingdom since the 7th of July 2005 London bombings. Many things have changed since the incident, and a Cobra meeting also took place on the 23rd of May with the Prime Minister at the time, Theresa May, raising the terror threat level in the UK to critical. This is its highest level. The threat level remained critical until the 27th of May, when it was reduced to its previous level of severe. For the first time ever in the aftermath of the attack, Operation Tempera was activated, allowing up to 5,000 soldiers to reinforce armed police in protecting parts of the country. The arena itself remained closed until September 2017, with scheduled concerts either cancelled or moved to other venues. The Prime Minister at the time announced an extra 13 million reimbursed from central government to the Manchester Public Services for most of the costs incurred by the attack. Now, as we alluded to at the beginning of this, we've taken information from a number of documents. You can find these at jessup.org.uk, and there is also a specific website, manchesterarenainquiry.org.uk, where you can find the volumes relating to the inquiry. We put a hell of a lot of work into trying to share these learnings in the hope that they will not be repeated. Please support your emergency service responders wherever you are in the world. We are collectively looking to do the best we can at every opportunity to save savable life. The actions of first responders require tremendous bravery and resourcefulness whilst confronting some of the horrific attacks and incidents that we have to attend on a daily basis. Look after each other out there, and we'll see you soon. Firefighters podcast is put together to develop, inspire, and hopefully even motivate those individuals who have chosen to serve our communities and be part of the first responder family. It's brought to you by myself, operational firefighter Pete Wakefield. If you have enjoyed today's episode and you want to see the podcast continuing, please head over to our Patreon page where you can support the ongoing efforts of the podcast. Please hit that follow, subscribe, or rate button on whatever platform you're listening to. Please support your emergency services responders, and thank you for listening.